The night of June 1st, 1941, settled over the southern coast of Crete like a shroud. On the beach at Sfakia, 5,000 men waited in silence. British, Australian, New Zealand soldiers pressed into the rocks and scrub, eyes fixed on the black horizon where the Mediterranean met the sky. Hours earlier, the last Royal Navy destroyer had slipped away into darkness, its decks crammed with evacuated troops. The promise had been simple: hold the line, retreat in order, and the ships would come. But the ships were gone. The men who remained understood what this meant: capture, prison camps in Germany or Austria, years behind wire, if they survived at all. Some wept quietly. Others sat in numb silence, rifles abandoned in the sand. The Battle of Crete was over, and they had been left behind. Then, as the moon rose pale and thin over the water, someone spotted movement on the waves, small shapes, wooden hulls cutting through the swell. Fishing boats, Greek fishing boats, moving toward the shore without lights, without permission, without orders from any command. The fishermen had come. To understand what happened that night requires going back to the spring of 1941, when the war in Europe had already consumed 2 continents and showed no sign of slowing. Greece had entered the conflict in October 1940, when Mussolini's Italy invaded from Albania, expecting quick victory. Instead, the Greek army fought with astonishing ferocity, driving Italian forces back into Albanian territory through mountain passes and winter storms. For months, Greece stood as the only nation actively defeating Axis forces on the ground. But this success carried a price. Hitler could not allow the humiliation to continue, nor could he permit British forces to establish bases in Greece that threatened his southern flank. On April 6, 1941, Germany launched Operation Marita. 5 panzer divisions, supported by overwhelming Luftwaffe air power, smashed through Yugoslav and Greek defenses. The campaign was brutal and swift. Thessaloniki fell within 3 days. Greek and Commonwealth forces fought desperate rearguard actions through mountain passes, but against German armor and Stuka dive bombers, the outcome was inevitable. By late April, British commanders ordered a general evacuation from mainland Greece. Under constant air attack, Royal Navy ships rescued over 40,000 troops from southern ports like Kalamata and Nafplio, ferrying them across the Mediterranean under cover of darkness. Thousands more were left behind, cut off by advancing German columns or unable to reach evacuation points in time. Many of those who escaped the mainland were transported to Crete, the large Greek island lying across the southern Aegean. Crete was supposed to be a defensive stronghold, a place to regroup and hold the line. The island's position made it strategically vital. From Cretan airfields, Allied bombers could reach the Romanian oil fields that fueled the German war machine. Possession of Crete also secured the eastern Mediterranean and protected the sea routes to Egypt and the Suez Canal. Losing Crete would expose the entire North African campaign to danger. But the island's defenses were inadequate. The troops arriving from Greece were exhausted, demoralized, and stripped of heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all had been abandoned during the chaotic retreat. On Crete, they found minimal supplies, poor communications, and incomplete fortifications. Major General Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand commander tasked with defending Crete, commanded a mixed force of approximately 42,000 troops. Among them were British infantry, Australian battalions, New Zealand brigades, and Greek soldiers who had escaped the mainland. Many Greek troops lacked even basic rifles. They carried old hunting weapons, obsolete firearms from previous wars, whatever could be found. Freyberg knew his position was weak, Intelligence reports indicated that Germany was preparing something unprecedented. Hitler had ordered Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of Crete. Never before had Germany attempted to capture territory entirely through air assault. The plan was audacious and risky. Transport aircraft would drop thousands of paratroopers directly onto key objectives: Malmö airfield, the town of Chania, the port at Heraklion, and the airstrip at Rethymno. If the paratroopers could secure an airfield, transport planes could land reinforcements and heavy weapons. Once established, German mountain troops would arrive to consolidate control. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, the sky over Crete filled with aircraft. Hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes roared overhead, disgorging paratroopers in waves. Gliders swept down carrying assault teams. The scene was surreal and terrifying, the sky blossoming with white parachutes as German Fallschirmjäger descended into defensive fire. Allied and Greek forces fought with desperate intensity. Cretan. Civilians joined the battle, attacking paratroopers with kitchen knives, axes, farm tools, whatever they could find. The initial German assault suffered catastrophic casualties. Paratroopers landed scattered and disorganized, many killed before reaching the ground or immediately after landing. At Malmö airfield, fierce fighting raged across the runway. 4. The first day, the Germans seemed on the verge of failure, but a critical miscommunication changed everything. During the night of May 20, 21, a New Zealand battalion withdrew from positions near Malmö airfield, believing they had been ordered to pull back. By dawn, German forces had seized the airstrip. Transport planes began landing, unloading reinforcements despite continuing fire. The balance shifted. With Malmö under German control, more troops and supplies poured onto the island. Allied forces, already low on ammunition and heavy weapons, began a fighting withdrawal. Over the following days, Commonwealth units fell back eastward, then south toward the coastal village of Sfakia, a small settlement on Crete's southern shore. The retreat across Crete became an ordeal of exhaustion and chaos. Thousands of soldiers marched over the White Mountains, rugged limestone peaks that form the island's spine. The paths were narrow, steep, and treacherous. Men carried wounded comrades on stretchers, improvised from rifles and blankets. Water was scarce. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly. German aircraft strafed columns whenever they appeared on open ground. Discipline began to fray. Units became mixed and disorganized. Officers tried to maintain order, but the soldiers knew they were being driven toward the sea with nowhere left to retreat. At Sfakia, the situation was desperate. The village consisted of a few stone houses clustered around a small harbor, backed by sheer cliffs. There was no proper port, just a narrow beach and rocky shoreline. As thousands of troops arrived, the area became impossibly overcrowded. Men sheltered in caves, under overhangs, anywhere that offered cover from German reconnaissance planes. Supplies were nearly exhausted. Food ran out. Medical facilities were non-existent beyond a few field dressing stations. The wounded lay in rows, untreated, their groans filling the night air. Royal Navy commanders faced an agonizing decision. The fleet had already suffered devastating losses during the Battle for Crete. German air superiority had proven lethal. 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers had been sunk. Many more ships were damaged. Over 2,000 sailors had died in attacks by Luftwaffe bombers and fighters. Every evacuation run risked more ships and more lives. Yet the Navy committed to bringing the soldiers home. On the night of May 28th, the first destroyers arrived at Sfakia under cover of darkness. Troops lined up in the dark, moving down to the beach in groups. Small boats ferried men to the waiting warships offshore. The process was slow and dangerous. Each ship could carry only so many soldiers before becoming overloaded and unseaworthy. As dawn approached, the destroyers had to withdraw to avoid being caught by German aircraft in daylight. The evacuations continued over 4 agonizing nights. Each evening, ships returned. Each morning, they departed before first light, decks crammed with troops. On the beach, the number of waiting men barely seemed to diminish. For every 100 evacuated, more arrived from the interior. Rumors spread through the ranks. Some said ships would come until everyone was saved. Others whispered that the Navy was abandoning them. Tension mounted. Order became harder to maintain. By the night of May 31st, the situation reached its breaking point. The remaining senior officers knew the truth. London had ordered the evacuation to end. The losses to the Royal Navy were unsustainable. Admiralty could not justify losing more ships. That final night, destroyers arrived for the last time. The embarkation was chaotic and bitter. Officers tried to organize lines to ensure rearguard units who had held off German pursuit were given priority. But desperation overtook discipline. Men pushed toward the boats. Some officers drew pistols to maintain order. Others simply looked away, understanding the terror driving the soldiers. By dawn on June 1st, the last destroyer slipped over the horizon. Approximately 16,000 Commonwealth troops had been evacuated from Sfakia. 5,000 remained on the beach. When the sun rose and the men realized no more ships were coming, the psychological impact was crushing. These were soldiers who had already retreated from Greece, fought across Crete, and marched over mountains to reach the sea. They had believed rescue was certain. Now they faced capture and imprisonment. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few began destroying personal items, letters, photographs, anything that might identify families back home. Among the abandoned soldiers were men who had shown extraordinary courage. Rearguard units who had held defensive positions to allow others to escape. Wounded men who had been promised evacuation. Young soldiers barely out of training. Veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Europe. All now faced the same fate. German forces were closing in. By midday on June 1st, German mountain troops would arrive at Sfakia to accept surrender. For the Commonwealth soldiers, the war was over before it had truly begun. But the Greek fishermen saw things differently. These were men from villages along the southern coast, Sfakia, Plakias, Lutro, Agia, Roumeli. They had watched the battle unfold. They had seen the paratroopers descend, heard the gunfire echo across the mountains, witnessed the streams of soldiers retreating south. They had helped where they could, offering water, bread, directions. Now they saw 5,000 men abandoned on the beach, waiting to be marched into captivity. To the fishermen, these soldiers had come to Greece to fight for their freedom. Greek forces had been part of the defense of Crete. The bond forged in combat meant something. And in the villages of Crete, hospitality was not merely custom, but sacred obligation. The fishermen began to gather. The soldiers waiting at Sfakia understood their situation in the cold mathematics of defeat. Capture meant years behind barbed wire in camps, scattered across Germany and Austria. It meant separation from families, hunger, disease, the slow, grinding erosion of hope. Many had already endured months of war, seen friends killed, survived battles where survival seemed impossible. Now all of it felt wasted. Private Colin Byrne of the 18th Battalion later described the moment of realization as worse than combat. In battle, you had purpose, action, the possibility of fighting back. On that beach, there was nothing but waiting. The despair was physical, a weight in the chest that made breathing difficult. Some men tried to maintain routine, checking equipment they no longer needed, cleaning rifles they would soon surrender. Others simply sat, staring at the water, lost in thoughts of home. Letters were burned, personal items thrown into the sea. Watches were buried in sand to keep them from German hands. Identity discs were hidden. The psychology of abandonment is peculiar. These men had not been defeated in traditional terms. They had fought hard and retreated in order. But being left behind carried a sense of personal failure, as if they individually had not been worthy of rescue. Officers tried to counter this, reminding troops that the decision was strategic, not personal. It made little difference. In the caves above the beach, wounded men who could not walk faced even darker prospects. They knew German forces had little patience for prisoners who could not march. Medical supplies were exhausted. Bandages were crusted with dried blood. Men with abdominal wounds lay in silent agony. Those with shattered limbs tried not to cry out. The doctors and medics who remained did what they could with nothing. For the Greek fishermen, the decision to act was not made in committee or by official command. There was no coordination, no organized plan handed down from resistance networks. Instead, it emerged from individual choices multiplied across a dozen villages. A fisherman named Mihalis in Sfakia looked at his boat, a small wooden kayak normally used for setting nets and catching grouper. He looked at the beach crowded with soldiers. He made a calculation. His boat could carry perhaps 15 men if they were willing to be cramped and uncomfortable. The sea was relatively calm. The distance to North Africa was formidable, over 100 miles of open water. But it was possible. The Germans had patrol boats and aircraft, but at night, a small wooden boat might slip through. Others made similar calculations. A fisherman named Georgos in Lautro owned a slightly larger vessel. Nikos from Agia Romeli had a boat with a small auxiliary engine in addition to sail. Dimitris had only oars and canvas, but a strong back and knowledge of currents. The risks were extraordinary. If caught by German patrols, the fishermen would be executed. Their families would be killed. Their villages would face collective punishment, a German practice already demonstrated in other occupied territories. Homes would be burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. Helping enemy soldiers was treason in German eyes, punishable by the harshest measures. Yet the fishermen also understood something else. Their island was now occupied territory. The life they had known was already over. German forces would requisition supplies, conscript labor, impose brutal order. Resistance, if it came, would be dangerous regardless. Saving these soldiers was an act of defiance, but it was also an act of humanity that defined who they were in opposition to who the occupiers were. The tactical challenges were immense. The boats were designed for coastal fishing, not open-sea voyages to North Africa. They lacked navigational instruments beyond simple compasses. There were no charts marked with safe routes. The fishermen navigated by stars, by the shape of waves, by experience accumulated over lifetimes at sea. At night, without lights, visibility was nearly zero. Running into German patrol boats was a real possibility, so was simply getting lost and drifting until fuel or water ran out. The distance to Egypt was over 160 kilometers, depending on the route. A fishing kayak under sail and auxiliary power might make 4 to 6 knots in good conditions. That meant 30 hours or more of continuous sailing, assuming favorable winds and no mechanical failures. The boats had no radios. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue. The soldiers themselves posed logistical problems. Most had no experience with small boats. Seasickness would be inevitable. There was no space to lie down, no shelter from sun or spray. Water and food would have to be rationed carefully. If a boat was overloaded and hit rough seas, it could capsize. Weight distribution mattered. Too many men crowded into the bow or stern could make the boat unstable and dangerous. The fishermen would have to manage soldiers who were desperate, exhausted, and unfamiliar with maritime realities. Yet there was also the cold calculus that made the risk worthwhile. Each trip that succeeded would save a dozen or more lives. Even if only half the attempts succeeded, hundreds of men might escape captivity. For soldiers facing years in prison camps, the offer of a dangerous voyage was no choice at all. It was hope, slim and fragile but real. As the first night after the final evacuation settled over Sfakia, word began to spread through the caves and shelters. Whispered conversations. A Greek fisherman approaching a British officer. Broken communication in limited shared vocabulary, supplemented with gestures and drawings in sand. Boats, Egypt, tonight. Small groups. The officers faced their own dilemma. They had no authority to authorize this. The evacuation had officially ended. Any soldier who attempted escape risked being shot as a deserter if caught. There were no guarantees the fishermen could be trusted. It could be a trap, a way for collaborators to hand soldiers over to Germans for reward. Yet the alternative was certain captivity. The officers began quietly selecting men. Priority went to those most likely to survive the voyage, and least likely to survive imprisonment. Wounded who could still move. Intelligence personnel who carried sensitive information. Young soldiers with long futures ahead. The selections were agonizing, another form of triage in a campaign built on impossible choices. For the British officers who remained, the appearance of the Greek fishermen created a crisis of conscience and command. Officially, surrender was imminent. General Freiberg had already departed Crete. The ranking officers at Sfakia were preparing to formally capitulate to German forces expected to arrive within hours. In military terms, organizing escapes at this point was arguably improper. Surrendering forces were expected to lay down arms and await capture in orderly fashion. Attempting escape could provoke German retaliation against those who remained. Yet these same officers had watched their men fight and bleed across two countries. They had made promises about evacuation that had not been kept, through no fault of their own. Now they were being offered a chance to save at least some of the soldiers under their nominal command. The decision required accepting that formal military structure had already collapsed. What remained was human obligation. Captain James Crawford of the Australian 207th Battalion later wrote in his diary that the choice was not between right and wrong, but between different kinds of failure. Surrendering everyone felt like betrayal. Attempting escape risked disaster. He chose disaster with hope over certainty without it. Other officers made similar choices. They began quietly identifying soldiers for the boats. The criteria were pragmatic and brutal. Men who could contribute to future fighting. Those with specialized skills. Youth was a factor. A 20-year-old private had decades of life potentially ahead. A 40-year-old sergeant had perhaps already lived most of his years. No one spoke these calculations aloud, but everyone understood them. The German response to the evacuation had been systematic and thorough. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft swept the southern coast daily, photographing beaches and harbors. Patrol boats from the Kriegsmarine moved along the shoreline. Mountain troops pushed south through the island's interior, securing villages and rounding up scattered Allied soldiers. The German command understood that some troops might attempt escape by sea. Intelligence reports noted the presence of fishing boats in coastal villages. Orders were issued. Any vessel attempting to leave Crete without authorization was to be sunk. Any civilians caught aiding enemy soldiers would be executed under martial law. Villages suspected of harboring fugitives would face collective punishment. These were not idle threats. In Yugoslavia and Poland, German occupation forces had already demonstrated willingness to massacre entire communities in response to resistance. Crete would be no different. The island's strategic importance meant occupation would be harsh and unforgiving. For the fishermen, this meant every trip was potentially fatal, not only for themselves, but for everyone they knew. A single fishing boat intercepted by a German patrol could result in 50 or 100 deaths in the home village. Children would be killed. Elderly parents would be shot. Houses accumulated over generations would be reduced to ash. This was the price that hung over every decision to push a boat into the water. Yet there was also a moral weight that pushed against fear. These fishermen were not soldiers. They had no training in combat, no experience with military operations. They were men who made their living from the sea, who understood wind and current and the temperament of fish. Their heroism was entirely voluntary and entirely civilian. In this, they represented something distinct from military valor. Soldiers accept risk as part of their profession. They are trained, equipped, and commanded within structures designed to manage danger. Civilians who choose to act in wartime do so without training, without support, without the psychological framework that makes military service possible. Their courage is therefore of a different quality, more personal and more fragile. A soldier can draw on unit cohesion, on orders, on the identity of being a warrior. A fisherman has only his own conscience and the faces of the men he might save. There were no medals waiting, no recognition, no promise that anyone would remember. Most expected they would be caught and killed. They went anyway. The soldiers selected for the boats felt a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and terror. Relief at the possibility of escape. Guilt at being chosen when others were not. Terror at the voyage ahead. Many had never been on small boats. The idea of crossing over 100 miles of open ocean in a wooden fishing vessel seemed insane. But the alternative was years behind wire, if they survived imprisonment at all. Stories had already circulated about conditions in German POW camps. Hunger, disease, brutal discipline, arbitrary violence. Some camps were worse than others, but none were places anyone wanted to go. For Australian and New Zealand soldiers, capture meant separation from home by literally half the world. Letters, if permitted, would take months to arrive. News of family would be scarce and unreliable. The psychological isolation would be as hard as the physical privation. Escape, even with its risks, offered the possibility of returning to the war, of continuing to fight, of eventual return home. Private John Desmond Peck, who had falsified his age to enlist and later stowed away on evacuation ships, described the decision in simple terms. You could wait for certain capture or risk probable death for possible freedom. When framed that way, the choice was obvious. The practical mechanics of loading the boats required careful coordination in darkness and near silence. German patrols were irregular but possible. Luftwaffe aircraft occasionally flew night reconnaissance. Any noise, any light, could bring disaster. The soldiers moved in small groups from caves and shelters down to the shoreline. They waded into the water, climbing aboard boats that rocked and shifted with each wave. The fishermen directed them, using gestures more than words. Weight distribution was critical. Too many men on one side could capsize the boat before it even left the beach. Equipment had to be minimal. Rifles were left behind. Packs were discarded. Canteens were filled. Each man became a calculation of weight versus value. When a boat was loaded, the fishermen would push off from shore, using oars initially to move through shallow water before raising sail or starting a small engine. The boats slipped away into darkness, becoming invisible within minutes. On the beach, those left behind watched them go, knowing their own turn might never come. The first boats departed Slovakia shortly after midnight on June 2, 1941. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to navigate the immediate shoreline, but not enough to make the boats visible from any distance. The sea was relatively calm, a fortunate condition that would not hold for every night. Michalis, the fisherman from Slovakia, had 15 British soldiers aboard his kayak. The boat sat low in the water, overloaded but still seaworthy. He had explained the route as best he could through an interpreter. They would sail southwest through the Libyan Sea, heading toward the Egyptian coast. If the wind held and the engine did not fail, they might reach the North African shore in 36 hours. There were no guarantees. The soldiers sat in silence, crowded together, feeling the boat rise and fall with the swell. Most had never been at sea beyond short ferry crossings. The motion was unsettling. Within an hour, several were seasick, leaning over the rail to vomit. Michalis kept his course, one hand on the tiller, eyes on the stars. He had made this crossing once before, years ago, fishing far offshore. He knew the general direction. The rest was faith and experience. Other boats followed at intervals. Georgos departed from Lautro with 12 Australians aboard. Nikos from Agia Rumeli carried 14 New Zealanders. Dimitris had only 8 men, limited by his smaller boat, but he pushed off with determination. Over the first night, at least 8 boats left the southern coast of Crete, carrying over 100 soldiers between them. The departures were staggered to avoid attracting attention. If one boat was intercepted, the others might still escape. The fishermen had no way to communicate with each other once at sea. Each boat became its own isolated world, a small wooden vessel carrying desperate men across a vast and indifferent ocean. As dawn approached on June 2nd, the boats were well offshore, beyond sight of land. This was the most dangerous time. German aircraft began patrols at first light. A fishing boat far from shore would be suspicious. If spotted, a plane might strafe the boat with machine gun fire or radio its position to patrol vessels. The fishermen directed soldiers to lie flat, to cover themselves with canvas or nets, anything to reduce the visual profile. The boats moved slowly, sails filled with morning breeze, small engines chugging steadily. Hours passed. The sun climbed, turning the sea into a glittering expanse that hurt to look at directly. There was no shade. The soldiers suffered under the heat, salt spray drying on skin, thirst becoming a constant discomfort. Water was rationed carefully. Each man received a few sips every few hours. It was never enough. By midday, Michalis spotted something on the horizon. A dark shape, low and fast-moving. His heart seized. Patrol boat. He adjusted course slightly, trying to put distance between his vessel and the contact. The soldiers noticed the change, sensed the tension. Someone asked what was wrong. Michalis gestured for silence. The shape continued on its course, parallel to them but not closing. Minutes stretched into an hour. The patrol boat disappeared over the horizon. Michalis released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The crossing continued. Other boats were not as fortunate. Dimitris, sailing with his 8 soldiers, encountered a German patrol boat just after dawn. The patrol approached, signaling for the fishing boat to halt. Dimitris kept sailing, pretending not to understand. The patrol boat fired a warning shot across the bow. Water erupted in a white plume 50 meters ahead. Dimitris had seconds to decide. He turned the boat sharply, heading directly away from the patrol. The soldiers aboard scrambled for non-existent weapons. The German patrol opened fire, machine guns raking the water around the fleeing caïque. Bullets punched through the wooden hull. One soldier was hit in the shoulder, blood spraying across the deck. Another round struck Dimitris in the leg. He fell, losing control of the tiller. The boat slewed sideways. A soldier grabbed the tiller, trying to steer, but he had no idea how. The patrol boat closed rapidly. Within minutes, it was alongside. German sailors boarded the fishing boat, weapons drawn. The soldiers were ordered to raise their hands. Dimitris, bleeding from his leg, was dragged upright. The Germans questioned him in broken Greek. Who authorized this voyage? Where were they going? Who else was helping? Dimitris said nothing. The German officer struck him across the face. Still, Dimitris remained silent. The soldiers were transferred to the patrol boat, hands bound. Dimitris was taken as well, accused of aiding the enemy. His fate was sealed. The fishing boat was left adrift, slowly filling with water from bullet holes. By evening, it had sunk, but 7 other boats continued. Michalis reached Egyptian waters on the evening of June 3rd. The North African coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon, solidifying into sand and scrub. He navigated toward a small harbor he knew from before the war. As they approached, British coastal patrol boats intercepted them, initially wary. When they understood what the fishing boat carried, the reaction was astonishment. 15 soldiers who should have been prisoners of war were instead free. The men disembarked, legs unsteady after 2 days at sea, faces burned by sun and salt. They were taken to a military facility, given water, food, medical checks. When intelligence officers interviewed them and learned how they had escaped, the story began to spread. Over the following 4 nights, the unauthorized evacuations continued. Each evening after dark, fishing boats would appear along the southern coast of Crete, moving cautiously toward beaches where soldiers waited. The operation became slightly more organized through improvised communication. Soldiers who remained at Sfakia and nearby villages passed word about times and locations. Greek villagers acted as intermediaries, guiding small groups of soldiers to departure points under cover of darkness. The scale remained small by necessity. Each boat could carry only a limited number. The risks remained extreme. Yet the evacuations persisted because the alternative was unacceptable. By June 5th, German mountain troops had secured most of the southern coast. The village of Sfakia was occupied. Soldiers who had not escaped were rounded up and marched north toward prisoner collection points. The Germans were thorough and methodical. Houses were searched. Caves were investigated. Any soldiers found hiding were taken into custody. The captured men began the long march back across the mountains they had struggled to cross days earlier. Without food or water provided, the march became another ordeal. Men collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Those who could not keep pace were left behind. The German guards showed limited patience. This was occupation duty, unglamorous and tedious, made bitter by the casualties German forces had suffered taking the island. Compassion was not a priority. For the fishermen who continued making trips, each voyage became more dangerous as German patrols increased. Yet some made multiple runs. Georgos completed 3 successful trips to Egypt, saving 36 men in total. Each time he returned to Crete, knowing the risk increased with each journey. On his 4th attempt, his luck ran out. A German reconnaissance aircraft spotted his boat in the early morning light of June 7th. The plane circled once, then dove, machine guns chattering. Bullets stitched across the water, walking toward the boat. Georgos steered hard, trying to make the boat a harder target. The soldiers aboard had nothing to fight back with. They could only watch as the aircraft climbed, turned, and dove again. This time, the bullets found their mark. The wooden hull splintered. 3 soldiers were hit, 1 killed instantly. Georgos took a round through the abdomen. The boat began taking on water rapidly. The aircraft made a 3rd pass, then flew off, apparently satisfied. The soldiers tried to bail water using their hands, but the damage was too severe. Within 10 minutes, the boat was sinking. They had no life preservers, no raft, nothing but open sea. Some soldiers could swim. Others could not. Georgos, mortally wounded, told them to swim south. Land was perhaps 15 kilometers away, an impossible distance, but the only direction that offered hope. Then he died, slumped over the tiller as his boat slipped beneath the surface. The soldiers struggled in the water. Those who could swim tried to help those who could not. Over the next hours, exhaustion and exposure claimed them one by one. Only 2 soldiers survived, washing ashore on the Libyan coast days later, more dead than alive. Despite losses, the evacuations achieved something remarkable. By mid-June 1941, approximately 2,000 Commonwealth soldiers had escaped Crete via the unauthorized fishing boat operations. This number came at significant cost. At least 15 fishermen were killed, some in combat with patrols, others executed after being captured. Dozens more were imprisoned. The villages that had supported the evacuations faced reprisals. In Sfakia, German forces burned homes suspected of harboring soldiers. In Lutro, villagers were interrogated, several beaten, 2 executed as examples. In Agia Rumeli, the entire male population over the age of 15 was rounded up and held for 3 days without food or water, a collective punishment designed to discourage further resistance. Yet the evacuations had succeeded in their primary goal. 2,000 men who should have been prisoners were free. They returned to military service in North Africa, fighting in subsequent campaigns across Libya and Egypt. Some eventually participated in the invasion of Italy. A few survived to see the end of the war. Their freedom was purchased with the blood and sacrifice of Greek civilians who owed them nothing but gave them everything. The soldiers themselves were permanently marked by the experience. Many spent the rest of their lives trying to locate the fishermen who had saved them, to express gratitude, to offer recompense. After the war, some returned to Crete, seeking out villages and families, bringing gifts, money, whatever they could offer. The bonds formed during those desperate nights proved unbreakable. Veterans of the Crete campaign spoke of the Greek fishermen with reverence, describing them as the bravest men they had ever known. This was not mere sentiment. They had seen courage in many forms, soldiers charging machine gun nests, pilots flying damaged aircraft home, medics treating wounded under fire. But the fishermen were different. They had chosen to enter danger with no training, no weapons, no support. They had done it knowing capture meant death, and that their families would share their fate. They had done it anyway. That kind of courage, born not from duty or command, but from pure moral choice, was something the soldiers recognized as extraordinary. By late June, the evacuations ended. German control of Crete was complete. Patrols were too frequent, surveillance too tight. The fishing boats returned to their traditional work, though the fishermen who survived carried scars both visible and hidden. The island settled into occupation, brutal and oppressive. But for a brief window in early June 1941, the courage of Greek fishermen had rewritten what seemed like inevitable fate for 2,000 men. The war continued, vast and consuming. But in one small corner, humanity had asserted itself against the machinery of conquest. The soldiers who reached Egypt arrived in various states of physical and psychological condition. Some had suffered nothing worse than sunburn, dehydration, and exhaustion. Others carried wounds from earlier fighting that had gone untreated for days. A few arrived with injuries sustained during the boat voyages themselves, bullet wounds from strafing aircraft or patrol boat encounters. All arrived with stories that seemed almost impossible. Military intelligence officers interviewed them systematically, compiling reports. The accounts were consistent. Greek fishermen, operating without orders or coordination, had ferried them across the Libyan Sea in small wooden boats. The officers recording these statements struggled with the implications. Official records showed the evacuation from Crete had ended on June 1st. The Royal Navy had withdrawn. Yet here were 2,000 men who should have been prisoners, standing on Egyptian soil. The discrepancy between official narrative and reality created administrative confusion. How should these men be classified? They had not been evacuated through proper channels. They had not escaped through their own efforts in traditional sense. They had been rescued by civilians in what amounted to an unauthorized humanitarian operation. Eventually, the bureaucracy settled on recording them as evacuated personnel, adding them to the official counts without detailed explanation of how they had arrived. For the soldiers themselves, the return to military life was complicated by survivors' guilt and a profound sense of debt. They had been saved while comrades had been left behind. 5,000 men remained prisoners because there had not been enough boats, enough time, enough luck. Some evacuated soldiers struggled with the randomness of selection. Why had they been chosen for a boat when others were not? What made their lives more valuable? There were no good answers. Officers who had made the selections carried their own burdens, remembering the faces of men they had not picked, knowing those men were now behind wire. The psychological weight of these decisions would persist for decades. In letters home, soldiers tried to explain what had happened. The censors who reviewed military mail were unsure what to allow. Descriptions of Greek civilians conducting rescues might compromise security or reveal information useful to the enemy. Many letters were heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out. Families received correspondence that made little sense, fragmentary accounts of boats and crossing and Greeks who helped. The full story would not emerge until after the war. In Crete, the aftermath was harsh and immediate. German occupation forces established control through systematic terror. Villages suspected of aiding evacuations faced investigations. The Germans interrogated village leaders, demanding information about who had participated. Names were extracted through threats and violence. When fishermen were identified, they were arrested. Some were executed immediately, shot in village squares as examples. Others were transported to prisons in Greece or Germany, disappearing into the maw of the occupation apparatus. Of the estimated 20 to 30 fishermen who participated in the unauthorized evacuations, fewer than half survived the war. Some died in custody. Others were killed in reprisal actions. A few managed to escape into the mountains, joining resistance networks that would fight a guerrilla campaign against occupation forces for the next 4 years. The families of executed fishermen faced additional punishment. Widows were denied ration cards. Children were barred from schools. Properties were confiscated. The message was clear. The cost of resistance was annihilation, not just of individuals, but of entire family lines. Collective punishments extended beyond families to entire communities. In Slovakia, German forces burned a dozen homes suspected of sheltering soldiers before the evacuations. The residents were given no opportunity to salvage possessions. They watched as flames consumed everything they owned. In Lautro, fishing boats were confiscated or destroyed, eliminating the economic basis of the village. Fishermen who had not participated in evacuations lost their livelihoods because others had. This was intentional. The Germans understood that effective occupation required breaking community bonds, creating distrust, making the price of any resistance so high that collaboration became the only rational choice. Yet the strategy had limited success. Cretan culture was deeply rooted in resistance to outside authority. The island had been conquered and occupied repeatedly throughout its history, by Venetians, Ottomans, Egyptians. Each time the Cretans had resisted, fought, endured. German occupation was simply the latest iteration of an old pattern. The brutality of reprisals hardened resolve rather than breaking it. By late 1941, organized resistance networks were forming in the mountains, supplied and supported by British Special Operations Executive. Many of the resistance fighters were men who had helped in the evacuations or whose family members had been killed by Germans. Their motivation was intensely personal. The official British response to the unauthorized evacuations was quiet and complicated. Publicly, the evacuation of Crete was reported as a military operation conducted by the Royal Navy, with appropriate acknowledgement of the Navy's losses and sacrifices. The role of Greek civilian fishermen was mentioned only briefly in official accounts, if at all. This was partly due to security concerns. Broadcasting the details of how soldiers had escaped might endanger future operations or put remaining civilians at risk. But it was also a matter of institutional discomfort. The British military establishment did not easily acknowledge that civilians had accomplished what the Royal Navy could not or would not continue. The narrative of Crete was supposed to be about brave defense and orderly evacuation. The reality was more chaotic and uncomfortable. Thousands of soldiers had been abandoned, saved only by the unsanctioned actions of fishermen operating outside any command structure. Admitting this publicly would raise difficult questions about strategic decisions and whether more could have been done. Yet within military circles, the story spread rapidly. Soldiers who had been saved told their comrades. Officers included the accounts in after-action reports. Veterans networks shared the tales. Over time, a counter-narrative emerged, one that existed alongside the official version but told a different truth. In this version, the heroes of Crete were not generals or admirals, but Greek fishermen, whose names were often unknown, whose faces were remembered only dimly, but whose actions had been decisive. After the war ended in 1945, efforts began to identify and honor these men. British and Commonwealth veterans organizations attempted to compile lists of the fishermen who had participated in the evacuations. This proved difficult. Many fishermen had died during the war. Others had survived but left no records. The evacuations had been conducted in darkness and chaos with minimal documentation. Soldiers often did not know the names of the men who saved them, had not shared a common language, had been focused simply on survival. The result was fragmentary information, stories without names, names without stories. Some fishermen were identified through post-war searches. Veterans traveled to Crete, visiting villages, asking questions. Occasionally, they found the right person, an aging fisherman who remembered those nights, who had survived the war, who had never expected anyone to come looking. These reunions were emotional and profound. Veterans wept, embracing men they had last seen in darkness on a boat deck decades earlier. Gifts were exchanged. Promises were made to stay in contact. Formal recognition came slowly. In 1947, the Greek government awarded medals to several fishermen identified as participants in the evacuations. The British government followed with similar honors, though the process was bureaucratic and incomplete. Many who deserved recognition never received it, their contributions lost in the chaos of wartime record-keeping. Some fishermen refused recognition, insisting they had done only what was necessary, that no special honor was warranted. This humility was characteristic of the men involved. They had not acted for glory or reward. They had acted because it was right. The post-war economic situation in Crete was dire. The island had been devastated by occupation, fighting, and reprisals. Villages were impoverished. Infrastructure was damaged. Fishing fleets had been destroyed or confiscated. Many fishermen who survived the war returned to find their boats gone, their equipment ruined. Rebuilding took years. Some veterans who located their rescuers provided financial assistance, sending money, arranging for new boats to be purchased, helping to rebuild what the war had destroyed. These efforts were individual and small-scale, but they mattered. A new boat could mean the difference between survival and starvation for a family. The broader historical reckoning with the evacuations took decades. Early histories of the Battle of Crete focused on military operations, strategic decisions, the performance of commanders. Civilian contributions were footnotes if mentioned at all. But as veterans aged and began publishing memoirs, the role of the fishermen received greater attention. Books appeared in the 1970s and 1980s that told the story in detail, based on interviews and personal accounts. Academic historians began to examine the evacuations as significant examples of civilian resistance and humanitarian action during wartime. The narrative shifted from one of military failure to one of human resilience and courage. Today, the story of the Greek fishermen who saved 2,000 soldiers from Crete is remembered as one of the most remarkable episodes of the Second World War. It is taught in schools, commemorated in monuments, retold in documentaries. The soldiers who were saved carried the memory throughout their lives. Many never forgot the faces of the fishermen, the feel of the wooden boat beneath them, the moment when hope returned in the form of a small vessel moving quietly through dark water. They told their children and grandchildren. They returned to Crete whenever possible. They ensured the story would not be lost. War is often remembered through the lens of battles and strategies, commanders and divisions, the movement of armies across maps. But the truth of war is found in smaller moments, in individual choices made under conditions of impossible pressure. The Greek fishermen of Crete did not change the strategic outcome of the Battle of Crete. Germany still occupied the island. The Allies still lost. The war in the Mediterranean continued with all its brutality and waste. Yet within that larger failure, something else occurred. 2,000 men lived who might have died. They returned to their families, had children, built lives. The ripple effects of those saved lives extended across decades and generations. That is the quiet arithmetic of courage. It does not alter grand historical arcs, but it changes everything for those it touches. The fishermen themselves did not think in these terms. They saw men who needed help. They had boats and knowledge of the sea. The decision was simple, even if the consequences were not. This kind of moral clarity is rare and precious. It stands in opposition to the calculations of war, which trade lives for strategic advantage, which sacrifice individuals for collective goals, which operate on the logic of necessity and expedience. What the evacuations from Crete demonstrate is that humanity persists even in the machinery of total war. The fishermen had every reason to prioritize their own survival and the safety of their families. They chose otherwise. They chose to believe that the lives of strangers mattered, that duty extended beyond law and command, that courage could be an act of defiance against the inhumanity that war demands. In doing so, they reclaimed agency in a situation designed to strip agency away. Occupation means submission. Resistance means death. Yet the fishermen found a third path: action without submission, resistance through salvation rather than violence. Their boats moved through darkness not toward battle, but away from it, carrying men toward life rather than death. This is not the heroism celebrated in martial traditions, the glory of combat, the honor of sacrifice in battle. It is something quieter and perhaps more profound. It is the heroism of those who save rather than destroy, who build rather than tear down, who offer hope when despair seems the only rational response. The fishermen of Crete were called many things during and after the war. Heroes, certainly, but also simply men who understood that when the world descends into darkness, the obligation of the living is to light whatever small candles they can. Their boats were those candles. The soldiers they saved were the light that survived. And in the end, that is what we remember. Not the defeats or the occupation, not the strategic failures or the lost battles. We remember the fishermen who went into the dark and brought men home.